Welcome, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me both on the recording and here in the room. My name is Nathan Wood, Associate Professor of History in the History Department of Eastern European History. And it's my pleasure to introduce the talk today and our speaker to tell you a little bit about the background. But before I do so, Eric Scott, the director of the Russian and East European and Eurasian Studies Center here at KU, wants to remind all of us here that we have the Spring Festival this Sunday, March 2nd, from 1 to 4 in historic Liberty Hall on Massachusetts Street. So please do make some time to come and enjoy yourself and celebrate on Sunday, March 2nd. All right, the Backus-Cięciała Lecture Series is dedicated in the memory of Professor Oswald P. Backus III, 1921 to 1972, and Professor Anna Cięciała, 1929 to 2014. Professor Backus was one of the early driving forces behind the development of KU as a nationally known center for the study of Russian Eastern Europe. In the 1960s, these efforts led to the formation of the Slavic Soviet Area Studies program, now known as CREASE. He taught history, law, and Slavic and Soviet area studies during his 22 years at the University of Kansas, and is credited as having helped make KU's Slavic library collection one of the finest in the nation. Anna Cięciała, meanwhile, was the professor of Eastern European history here at KU, where she began working in the early 1960s after completing her dissertation at Indiana University, and she taught here until 2002. Her most acclaimed work was Katyn, A Crime Without Punishment, which she published with two other historians. Professor Cięciała was a longtime member of the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences of America, or PIASA, and presently there's a book prize award for the best book in a given year, a multi-authored book, so with more than one author. And our speaker today is here in part because of a similar award from PIASA, the Halecki Book Prize, and Professor Kunakhovich's book, Communism's Public Sphere, Culture as Politics in Cold War Poland and East Germany, won an honorable mention last year. I had the privilege to serve on that committee, and very, very excited about this scholarship. So it was a real pleasure to have Professor Kunakhovich yesterday in my Everyday Communism in Eastern Europe class to talk a bit about a chapter that we read in his book and its background. Allow me to tell you just a little bit about the book because the talk today is on a new project. So this elegantly argued book also won the Kolchitsky Book Prize from the Association of Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies and was also shortlisted for the Waterloo Center for German Studies Book Prize. So both in sort of Slavic and German studies, this is a highly acclaimed work. This elegantly argued book explores the complex and often unexpected relationship between the state, cultural producers, and society in Poland and East Germany during the communist era. Each corner of this triangular dynamic depended on the other two, and Kunakhovich shows that even in the early days of communism, the party could not merely dictate culture. So taking Krakow and Leipzig as case studies, he illuminates the gray zone of cultural production and dissident thought, showing that the two worlds were never as separate as has been assumed. While theater, visual art, literature, music, and film were supposed to help spread communist ideals, they were also sites of negotiation and resistance. So this is an absolutely fantastic book. I have a copy in my bag. I can send it around. I don't want to distract, however, from the talk, so just bear that in mind. Meanwhile, just to add a little bit about Dr. Kunakhovich, he's also the author of The Long 1989, and this is a co-edited volume, and is now working on this new project on the Polish origins of world heritage. So please join me in welcoming Kyrill to speak for us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nathan, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to Eric and to Ezra for inviting me here and organizing this trip. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, especially as part of the Backus-Cięciała lecture. And as Dr. Wood mentioned, I would like to share with you a new project that I'm just starting to develop about the Old Town of Warsaw. And I'll start this story at the end. I'll start in September of 1980, when the Old Town of Warsaw became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this was actually a very controversial case. Perhaps the first controversial case in the history of the list. The UNESCO World Heritage List was inaugurated in 1978. Poland submitted its application for the Old Town of Warsaw that same year, but it was deferred twice and was the subject of considerable debate because, as you may know, although it looks and is called old, this town was in fact built in the 1950s, or I should say rebuilt. The Old Town of Warsaw was leveled by the Nazis in World War II. It was then rebuilt wholesale during the Stalinist era, and critics charged that this was, in effect, a Disneyland, a pastiche, inauthentic, fake. And the idea of listing such a site on the World Heritage List provoked a lot of bitter debate. And yet, in 1980, the site was in fact inscribed. It was inscribed in a very particular way. And I'll show you the precise text here. When the Bureau of the World Heritage Committee approved the site, it listed it as a symbol of reconstruction of a cultural property. So not as a beautiful site, not as a historic site, but as a symbol of post-war reconstruction. And then it went on. It furthermore recommends that no other cultural properties which have been reconstructed should be entered on the list. So in fact, the Old Town of Warsaw became the symbol of reconstruction in post-war Europe and actually even beyond. And in that sense, it was intended as an exception. Warsaw Old Town was meant to be an outlier on the World Heritage List. That is inscribed along with this listing. What I will argue today is that it is not, in fact, an outlier. That the Old Town of Warsaw became something quite different. It became a model for how the list operates today. And to make that case, I will walk you through 4 parts of my argument, asking 4 interrelated questions. So first, I'd like to ask how the Old Town came to be rebuilt at a time when most architects frowned on the notion of reconstructing buildings that had been destroyed. I will then ask whether, in fact, this Old Town is an identical reconstruction, as UNESCO had called it. And as you may suspect from my title, I will answer no. I will then look at how this case of reconstruction became internationally known, and how a contentious site on the other side of the Iron Curtain acquired enough international renown to get listed despite an awful lot of controversy. And finally, I will explore the ways in which a site intended to be exceptional instead became paradigmatic, the way in which Warsaw's inscription on the list has shaped the way that the list continues to function today. So with that overview, let me go back to the beginning of the story and start with part 1, the Phoenix. This is what the Old Town of Warsaw looked like in March 1945, shortly after Nazi forces withdrew from the city. It had been damaged first by Nazi bombing in 1939, then by some Allied bombing in the course of the war, but Warsaw came to look the way it did because it was systematically blown up by Nazi forces in retaliation for a series of uprisings. First, in 1943, parts of Warsaw that had been turned by the Nazis into a ghetto were leveled in the wake of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And then the following year, in the summer of 1944, this old town was burned, which is what accounts for this characteristic look of burned out windows. it was burned as retaliation for the Warsaw Uprising. And we have some remarkable pictures taken by a member of the Home Army, which initiated this uprising against Nazi troops. We have Eva Faryashevska's photographs of the Old Town Market in flames, of Krzywokoło Street, which leads out onto the Old Market. And in fact, this was the last photograph that Faryashevska would take. She was killed on this same street later that week. The end result of all that was that the Old Town of Warsaw was a heap of rubble at war's end. And it was so destroyed, in fact, that Polish authorities genuinely contemplated abandoning the city. There was one proposal to move the capital to Łódź, which had survived the war in better shape. There was even a proposal to leave Warsaw as a memorial, a museum in ruins, to remind future generations of the horrors of World War II. And yet, those proposals did not come to pass. And that is thanks in part to these two men, lifelong friends, Stanisław Lorenz and Jan Zachwatowicz. Lorenz was an art historian. He was the director of the National Museum in Warsaw for more than 50 years. And after World War II, he became head of the Directorate for Museums and Historic Preservation, a national organization in post-war Poland. Zachwatowicz was an architect and historic preservationist. He became head of the general directorate. He became the general conservator, I should say, of historic monuments in post-war Poland. And these two men, as well as their like-minded colleagues, made the case that not only could Warsaw be saved from the ruins, but that it was imperative to do so. And I'll give you Zachwatowicz's own words here. He spoke about it in August 1945, shortly after the end of the war. And this is what he said. The importance of monuments for the nation was revealed with drastic clarity by the experience of recent years, when the Germans, wanting to destroy us as a nation, demolished the monuments of our past. Because the nation and the monuments of its culture are one. This political thesis leads to fundamental conclusions not always consistent with a scientific view. And I'll talk about what he meant there in a second. But let's unfold his argument. Since we cannot tolerate the snatching away of our cultural monuments, we will rebuild them. The feeling of responsibility towards future generations demands the reconstruction of what was destroyed, a full reconstruction conscious of the tragedy of historical falsehood being committed. So the core idea here is, in effect, we can't let the Germans win. German forces set out to systematically destroy Warsaw and much of Poland by eliminating our leaders, our culture, our buildings. To allow that to happen would be to admit defeat. In fact, it would be to help the Nazis get away with their plans. There's a responsibility, argued Zachwatowicz, to right this historical wrong, to defend the nation, even though, as he suggested, it was not always consistent with a scientific view. So what did he mean when he said that? Well, the general attitude among historic preservationists at the time was to leave old ruins alone. This was exemplified by the first major international congress for the restoration of historic monuments that met in 1931. And this conference noted that there's a general tendency to abandon restorations, instead to ensure the preservation of buildings as they are. In fact, this Athens Charter went on. It said, in addition to sort of preserving these monuments, we should study the ornamental vegetation most suited to them, right? How to represent and surround these ruins in the most atmospheric way to make them stand out, much in the way that Whitby Abbey and many other British sites were preserved. in the late 19th, early 20th century. That is very much counter to what Zachvatowicz was proposing, and he acknowledged that he was violating these norms, the norms of non-restoration, non-intervention, norms that were themselves a reaction to a previous era of restoration, a kind of over-enthusiasm for restoration, at least as many professionals saw it, one associated often with the French architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who would do things like this, right? Encountering the city walls of Carcassonne as they were at the top, he imagined what they should have looked like, how they may have looked like, projected his own fantasies of what a Gothic city wall should look like, and therefore rebuilt them as a kind of fantasy. There was a strong reaction to that, especially in England, spearheaded by thinkers like John Ruskin and John Morris and Edward Morris. And the program that Zachvatowicz was proposing was, in many ways, counter to those principles of non-intervention that had been de rigueur. He justified it, though, by pointing to the nation. Right? We saw this word appear already in his statement. He made the case that this old town, this is what's written here, was a document of national culture, that it needed to be preserved, that this was essential for saving the Polish nation. So his plan for rebuilding Old Town Warsaw was a fundamentally nationalist project. But it was also, I would argue, a communist project. And we see here the leader of the Polish United Workers' Party, not yet, but soon to be, Bolesław Bierut, who is identified here as the first builder of Warsaw, one of his many monikers. The reason this was also a communist project is because the regime had a lot to gain from this project of reconstruction, as it saw it. For one thing, it stood to gain political legitimacy. Bierut had spent much of the war in the Soviet Union. He was widely seen as a foreigner and an outsider. So reconstructing the old town, reconstructing the national culture of Poland was a way to assert his nationalist credentials. It was a way to establish common ground between the party and much of Polish society. And as a result, the regime embraced this project for what it represented, embraced it as a nationalist dream, but in a communist key. And in fact, the whole project was only possible because of communist conditions. I'm showing you here the old town side by side, pre and post-war. As you can imagine, this had all been private property before World War II. The idea of reconstructing an entire swath of town like that depended on nationalization, which is what Bierut did. In November of 1945, all of this land became state land. That made it possible to carry out a program of such a vast scale without having to deal and negotiate with individual owners. And when construction really started, a few years later in 1950, this became a typical Stalinist construction site. There were train tracks that were built to carry out rubble and old bricks. New bricks were built by the same bricklayers that had built Nowa Huta and other modern communist developments across Poland. And construction proceeded at shock tempo. These are graphs familiar across the Eastern Bloc at the time of overfulfilling one's quota, the same kind of folk dances that took place across the bloc as well, and of course the omnipresent picture of the leader. So this was a deeply Stalinist project, the rebuilding of Warsaw. That's signified as well by the date of its delivery, July 22nd, 1953. This is the anniversary of the so-called July Manifesto, the formation of a communist-led post-war government for Poland, the city was unveiled, the Old Town was unveiled to the public as a sign, as a commemoration of 9 years of communist rule. And this had been a remarkable achievement, right? The contrast between what the Old Town had looked like in 1945 and what it was rebuilt as by 1953 is stark. And certainly looking at the two photographs side by side, one might conclude that the Old Town was rebuilt exactly as it had been, right? Building by building, using careful analysis precisely of photographs like this to reconstruct it ostensibly identically. And yet, it's not quite what happened. That brings me to part two, the fantasy. So what do I mean when I suggest that the Old Town was not exactly the same after the war? Well, for one thing, the parts that were reconstructed were only the facades. Behind the facades was a modern set of apartments, as this book proudly promised, outfitted like all housing developments in Warsaw. So the Old Town, as we saw, was a front. Behind it was completely new architecture. But the fronts, the facades, changed as well. And this is especially visible just south of the Old Town on Nowy Świat Street, which is the main thoroughfare running through central Warsaw. This is what it looked like in the 1930s, before the war. And the way it was rebuilt is considerably different. Buildings were made lower, the architectural style was changed, and this was a realization of long-term complaints by critics, like, for instance, these two writers, who spoke of Nowy Świat as a terrible barbarity from the times of Russian captivity, one of the greatest construction scandals from the years of partition. What they referenced is that between the late 18th century and 1918, Warsaw was part of the Russian Empire. That Nowy Świat had been built up under Russian rule, and for certain nationalist critics, this was perceived as a foreign domination. And so rebuilding the city was also an opportunity to right that historical wrong. Right? In Zachwatowicz thinking, it was not only the destruction by the Nazis that needed to be undone, it was also the effects of Russian rule. And in that sense, Nowy Świat was modeled on pre-Russian architecture. This is a photo from the 19th century, but much of the built environment dates to the 18th. So transforming Warsaw, transforming it in line with pre-partition history was an explicit goal. Lorenz admitted as much when he came to my neck of the woods in colonial Williamsburg in 1963 and explicitly said a principle was adopted that excluded the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. In other words, precisely the years when Poland did not have sovereignty, did not exist on the map of Europe. And he went on to add something more. He said the inner courtyards, at first empty, were intensively built up in the 18th century, still more in the 19th. There was, of course, no historical reason to rebuild these later additions. So in addition to transforming streets like Nowy Świat, what Lorenz is describing is a decision to avoid rebuilding certain courtyards. For instance, here I have an illustration, right, a graphic of Old Town in 1944 and one in 1980. And you can see what I mean here, right? Areas that were heavily built up behind main buildings were then cleared out, right? Were given over to empty space. And Lorenz insisted that this was an obvious decision, that there was nothing lost. These were not architecturally significant sites. These were not particularly interesting or valuable, and so there was no reason to reconstruct them. But what was lost in not reconstructing them? Well, that speaks a lot to the people that lived in the Old Town. before World War II. And specifically, it's Jewish communities. Jewish residents have a long history in Warsaw, but they were banned from living in the city for much of the early modern era until 1768. So when Lorenz speaks about not reconstructing additions built in the 18th and 19th centuries, he's speaking very clearly about not reconstructing places and parts of the city where Jewish communities were centered. And in Warsaw, most Jewish residents lived outside of the Old Town because up until the mid-19th century, they were generally banned from living inside the Old Town. This is a graphic showing sites of worship, synagogues, and houses of prayer, and it gives you a sense of the center of gravity of the Jewish population. Most of Warsavian Jews lived in this part of town around Muranów. This would later become the Nazi ghetto. And the proportion, according to the 1930 census, of Jewish inhabitants in that region approached 90%. It was almost exclusively Jewish. In the Old Town, the proportion was much lower. It's about 15%. But even so, as you can see, there are sites of worship here. The absolute numbers, about 2,300 Jewish residents here in the Old Town, 1,700 over here in what's called the New Town. So these are substantial communities. And we know a fair amount about them, in part thanks to this man, Alter Kaczyzny. He is a Polish-Yiddish writer. He published a novel, The Strong and the Weak, that's set in the Old Town. And I've given you a short excerpt here. The Mokem is the Yiddish word for town and also for safe harbor. The Mokem has its own breath, an air that doesn't circulate with the air of Warsaw. The residents have a different look, both Jews and Christians. They're withered, as if the dust of past generations clings to them. They're gray. They carry with them the shadow of tight alleys between high walls. The Old Town, by this time when Kaczyzny was writing, was very much run down. This was not an elegant part of town. This was not a grand part of town. It was poor. And a lot of these outhouses, these additions, as Lorenz called them, was the effect of growing populations and especially growing Jewish presence in the town. We have, in addition to descriptions, images from Kaczyzny himself. He was also a photographer as well as a writer, and so we have photographs of Jewish life in the Old Town that document the poverty, the close quarters, some of these irregular spaces that existed here before the war. After the war, we can see that they were systematically stripped out. So again, I'm relying here on Eleonora Bergman's work. In yellow are houses that contained Jewish spaces of prayer, typically, again, in back alleys and in courtyards. And you'll see, right, that all the yellow spaces identified on this map are absent from the Old Town as it was rebuilt. Part was replaced by unearthed city walls. Part was given over to a courtyard. But there is a systematic stripping away of those layers of history. And so the Old Town, as it emerged in 1958 on this photograph, was far from an identical reconstruction. It looked quite different, as I've suggested, right? There are courtyards where there had not been before. There are facades that look different. Certainly the interiors are quite different. But more than that, this is a kind of fantasy. This is a certain idea of what the Old Town could have looked like, should have looked like, in the eyes of its planners, without fate intervening. An Old Town that is simultaneously historic and modern, like the nation itself. An Old Town without traces of Russian rule, and also without traces of Jewish presence. Right? This is a vision, a fantasy, one that, as I suggested, suits both nationalist and communist interests. But it also becomes an international vision and an international projection. This brings me to part 3, the pioneer. While World War II is still going, in the last days, in May 1945, the National Museum, directed by Lorenz, opens an exhibition. It's called Warsaw Accuses, and it's aimed as much at the Polish public as it is at international audiences. And it's meant to document the destruction that the Nazis have wrought on Warsaw. You see empty picture frames to symbolize looted art. You'll see reproductions of works that are destroyed. You'll see some of the photographs that I've been showing you given here as evidence to document the destruction wrought upon the city. This exhibition then goes on tour. It travels to the United States and to Europe. In the US, the young Czesław Miłosz, a future Nobel Prize-winning poet, helps to organize it in his role as cultural attaché to the Polish embassy. The exhibition goes to New York, Washington. We see it here in Chicago. There's a glossy brochure with an introduction by urban critic Louis Mumford. Walter Gropius speaks about it. Eleanor Roosevelt is part of it. This is an international effort to present Warsaw to the world under a new title. No longer Warsaw Accuses, but Warsaw Lives Again, a more kind of optimistic, future-oriented vision. And this exhibition is representative of a broader effort on the part of these Polish planners and officials to publicize their project abroad. As I mentioned, it's not only a domestic project, this is from the start understood as an international story and an international model to present to the world. And so from the start, the organization responsible for reconstruction, this is the abbreviation BOS, Bureau for the Reconstruction of the Capital, it devotes scarce resources to sending not only exhibitions abroad, but some of its architects to present on what they're doing. And so Piotr Biegański, who is Zachwatowicz's right-hand man, is sent to Rome. And I've given you a little excerpt from a letter in the archives that describes the situation, right? He is entirely burnt out, entirely reduced to nothing, has no appropriate clothing. Therefore, this organization, BOS, writes to the supply ministry asking for a coat, a suit, shoes, and some underwear. This is the conditions of Poland in the fall of 1945. There is ruins and not much else. And yet, officials spend those precious resources on promoting their story abroad. Biegański goes to Rome. He delivers a talk about the plans for reconstructing the city. It is eventually published in Italian with illustrations and a plan. And Biegański also meets an influential Italian architect named Roberto Pane, I should say. And when Roberto Pane organizes, a few years later, a meeting for preservationists at UNESCO in Paris, he invites Zachwatowicz, along with other Polish architects, and more than that, he singles out Warsaw as a case study of reconstruction. You can see, right, images 1 through 4, the first pictures he chooses are all from Warsaw. Pane is critical, in principle, of the idea of rebuilding. At this meeting, he says, destroyed monuments should not be restored to their original form, but new design should be adopted, right? He's kind of hewing to that orthodoxy of don't rebuild. But kind of makes an exception for Poland. He says Poland is the state that has suffered the greatest damage during World War II. Therefore, it is essential to reconstruct in order to preserve what is left. So this international community is kind of carving out a certain exception for Poland. And over time, it becomes more and more of an exception to the point where it becomes a model. The same Pane, a few years later, is now reproducing plans for the rebuilt Old Town as exemplars for Italian and other European cities. A few years later, the second big congress of historical preservationists, Pane acknowledges the countries of Eastern Europe have shown a much greater concern compared to those of the West for the conservation and care of their cultural property. Now he's elevating these Polish efforts on a pedestal. And he's not the only one to do so. A year prior, in 1962, when the French Parliament is debating a law that is commonly known as Malraux's law, after cultural minister and French writer André Malraux, this is a law that preserves old towns in France from development. Malraux makes an explicit connection to Warsaw. Let us not destroy the old streets of Avignon at the same time that Poland has restored the oldest square in Warsaw, brick by brick. Right? Again, elevating Poland as a pioneer in this process of safeguarding cities. The United States does the same thing. In 1966, Congress passes the US National Historic Preservation Act. This is really the foundation for preservationism in this country. I've been walking around campus the past couple of days. There are lots of signs that highlight that many buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places. This is the act that establishes the register. It is inspired in many ways by the demolition of the old Penn Station in New York as part of Robert Moses's modernization plans. But when the congressional committee charged with writing this act, when it's deliberating what to propose, it goes on a field trip. It's called the Raines Committee. It goes to Warsaw. In its report, reproduces the destroyed old town, contrasts it with the rebuilt town, and puts it side by side with a city hall from South Dakota, right, to emphasize that this is very much a model for the United States. In fact, Raines writes that after seeing what Poles accomplished, we suggest an expansion and development of our own programs, placing greater emphasis on government support. So this Polish vision, you can see it sort of spreading gradually and intentionally, right? There's a real effort from the start to make this an international program, and it spreads further and further. And really the culmination perhaps comes in 1965 with the founding of ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. This body is still in place, is part of the UN UNESCO umbrella of organizations, and it reviews today all applications from cultural sites for the UNESCO World Heritage List. This body is founded in Poland. Lorenz, whom you see here, is the president of his first Congress. The Congress takes place in Warsaw. A visit to the old town as part of the program. All the delegates watch a movie about the rebuilding. And when ICOMOS, a few years later, creates the position of honorary memberships, Lorenz and Zachwatowicz are two of the first three honorary members chosen. This is really a Polish-inspired organization through and through. And that is really how we get to this, to the inscription of Warsaw on the World Heritage List. Part 4. The World Heritage List is decreed by the World Heritage Convention, adopted in 1972, and it really marks a point of departure for UNESCO. Today, this is what we associate UNESCO with. It's kind of synonymous with historic preservation and heritage. That was not at all the case in its early years. UNESCO was seen as basically another World Bank, as a fund for international development. It was much more renowned for large-scale development projects like this, shown in the UNESCO Courier. And I've pulled some of the text here that highlights this point, right? In introducing a new dam being built in Italy, the editors write, "The ancients created great wonders of the world, like the pyramids of Egypt, but amazing as were these wonders of antiquity, they pale before the wonders of modern times. The Hanging Gardens, Pharos at Alexandria sink into insignificance before the skyscrapers, public buildings of today. The pyramids are equaled by the pyramids of our own century. Right? Out with the old, in with the new was very much the motto of UNESCO in its early days. And yet, it could find something to latch onto, to celebrate in a case of reconstruction like Warsaw. Right? This was a kind of project that allowed it to celebrate technology, modern achievements, right? Modern capacities, the transformation of ruin into a bustling city, the architectural technologies that allowed for the rebuilding of Warsaw. In fact, when UNESCO, a few years later in 1965, declared a campaign to safeguard monuments, it did so by highlighting another site of reconstruction. One that I showed you earlier, the very same walls of Carcassonne, rebuilt by Viollet-le-Duc, once dismissed as a historic imitation, now praised as a remarkable feat of restoration, a remarkable feat of engineering. So this idea of rebuilding destroyed artifacts kind of becomes a back way for UNESCO to get on board with the idea of historic preservation, a way to appreciate the value of monuments by seeing them as products of modern technologies. And I'll note here, too, that the vocabulary that this campaign uses is quite striking. UNESCO calls it a world campaign to protect our cultural heritage. This doesn't sound like anything special until you look at the history of the word. I'm drawing here on Google's giant cache of books, but you can see up until really 1960, the word heritage is extremely rare. People don't talk about heritage. It's only in the 60s and 70s and beyond that heritage really takes off. It's about 10 times more popular today than it was 50 years ago. And this change, I think, is quite telling. And I'll draw here on the work of the folklore scholar and heritage studies scholar Anne Erickson, who makes this point. She says, the terminological developments from the typical 18th century term antiquities to the 19th century term historical monuments to the phrase cultural heritage, this is not random linguistic variation, but are expressions of different historicity regimes. In other words, she argues words matter, right? The fact that UNESCO speaks of heritage, this is something new. And she goes on to say what that is. What defines the objects or sites is no longer age, antiquities, or historical consequence, as it was for monuments, but interest. The terms property, cultural property, heritage, do not describe the objects they apparently refer to, but rather a specific relationship to them, shaped by interest. So the point she's making, we may disagree, but her claim is there's something fundamentally different in talking about heritage than talking about monuments, right? Monuments are about relics of the past, sites of beauty. Heritage is all about our interest in those sites. And we see this idea, I think, in the World Heritage Convention itself. This is a document that says nothing about age. It doesn't say sites on the list have to be old. It doesn't say they have to be beautiful. It doesn't say they have to be historic. The only criterion, and it's still in place today, is sites need to have outstanding universal value. It's really about value rather than anything intrinsic to the object. And I think we really see this idea in the case of Warsaw's Old Town. So that when ICOMOS takes up an evaluation, Warsaw submits, or I should say Poland submits an application in '78. It's delayed and pushed forward a couple of times. In 1980, ICOMOS submits a very positive assessment. That's what paves the way for the site to be listed. And the way it does it, I think, is telling. It says, this is about being associated with events. Following the insurrection in August 1944, the Polish capital was annihilated. From these ruins, the will of the nation brought to life again a city. the reconstruction of the historic center so that it is identical with the original symbolizes the will to ensure the survival of one of the prime settings of Polish culture. So what's interesting here, right, is what's missing. ICOMOS, it's a council for monuments and sites. It says nothing about monuments or sites. It says nothing about the architecture of the old town, about its historical or artistic merits. It says this is a symbol of the nation, a symbol of popular will, of endurance. It's all about the values that these structures now represent. And it makes a kind of secondary point. This will be familiar to you. To support this request, we may cite another reason. The reconstruction has exercised a considerable influence in the majority of European countries on the evolution of doctrines of urbanization and preservation. So ICOMOS, as we've seen, right, founded in Poland, the product in many ways of Polish influence, acknowledges here that Warsaw has become a model, has become an example around the world. And it continues to be so in shaping the list. So before the list comes into being, it's decreed in 1972. The first sites are listed in 1978. But the year before, a variety of experts gather to meet and discuss what outstanding universal value means in practice. What kind of a list will this really be? That's very much up in the air. One of those experts is Krzysztof Pawlowski. He is Poland's deputy conservator of monuments. He is elected vice chairman of the meeting, and he recalls, I was able to exercise a certain influence on formulating the criteria for selecting candidates, right? Poland continues to be an insider, to have this power behind the scenes. What influence? Well, he writes, I really challenged the notion of authenticity. He fights against the idea that buildings need to be authentic to make it on the list. And to the question, would Poland propose inscribing the Old Town of Warsaw had it not been destroyed? I replied, no, because it was not the initial worth of this oldest part of town that justified the nomination, but rather the quality and symbol of its reconstruction, which underlined the nation's will to document its identity. That part makes it wholesale into the ICOMOS inscription, but it establishes more broadly the idea that it is the symbolism, it is the will, it is the idea that is being inscribed on the list. It's not about the bricks, it's about what they represent. And today, the World Heritage List is massive. There are 1,223 sites as of today. And very few of them are reconstructed like Warsaw. It's not a very common pathway. But I would argue that the way in which Warsaw was inscribed, and as you've seen, it's not accidental that it was inscribed that way. It was the product of years of Polish influence and pressure. That way still shapes every site on the list, even if those sites have very different histories. And I'll give the example of my home site. I teach at the University of Virginia. We are a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of Monticello and the University of Virginia. So a group of buildings associated with Thomas Jefferson. And I'll just quote this little passage at the top of the page that explains and justifies this listing. Jefferson's use of an architectural vocabulary based upon classical antiquity symbolizes both the aspirations of the new American Republic and the cultural experimentation that could be expected. Again, right? This is a listing. This is not a reconstructed site. This is authentic, it's genuine. Nothing here about the architecture, nothing here about historical events, nothing here about beauty or significance in terms of its impact on the American Revolution. It's really all about this idea, right? That it's a symbol of aspirations. It's the inheritor of European tradition. It's a form of cultural experimentation. These are abstracted values that are attached to concrete sites. And I would argue that is in many ways a legacy of the Old Town of Warsaw. That was the first major debate in the World Heritage Committee. It really paved the future of the World Heritage List. And ironically, it represents one of the greatest legacies of the communist Polish regime, right? This is a Stalinist project constructed in 1953 at the height of Stalinism that is now shaping not only its own inscription on the list, but that is shaping the way that the list works. And I think recognizing that legacy and telling some of this history helps us appreciate the Polish origins of World Heritage. Thank you.